This evening's talk is going to be around a view from the trenches. And as always, to be expected, a view from the trenches is not always pretty. It's not pretty, it's not always fun, but it's practical, and that's where we learn some of the best lessons. I'm going to ask you to indulge me as the previous speaker, Sharon. I'm South African, so my accent is a little bit awkward, but I'm sure we'll get by. So let's talk about what we're going to do in this session. We've got 30 minutes. Now, 30 minutes is not a long time. I'm not going to bombard you with technical tools. We've seen some terrific ones and some terrific technique this evening and yesterday from the other speakers. So I'm going to take more of a pragmatic approach and look at some of the outcomes that we can get from a year's worth of sitting in the trenches and doing OsInt on a day-to-day basis. So start out. What have I learned in the last year? Well, lesson number one for anybody who's a Blackadder fan, and if you're not, I suggest you should chastise yourself, and you should be. Over the top, get out of the trenches, take the fight to the enemy. You have to move forward. You cannot stand and be in a defensive position all the time. You have to check and maintain your tools and equipment all the time. Researching new tools is a passion. It's incessant, and it's something that you have to work with on a daily basis to keep track of which tools are going out of flavor. We've seen the recent removal of Google Cache, and we're anticipating more changes to Google on the way. So you've got to stay abreast of that and keep going. Third lesson, plan longer and work less. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the case studies, and I'm going to show you why these are the learning outcomes that I've taken for this year. Ultimately, review and repeat. Do it again, do it again, do it again, and stick to the methodology. Yes, I'm going to bang on a little bit about methodology again. Live with it. So if you want to catch the big fish, you need a good lure. If you want to go over the top, you have got to have a really great luring profile. Now, we're used to talking around covert profiles and using sock puppets in order to increase our engagement, get that little bit closer to the target. But what about luring puppets? What about puppets that are created to lure the targets to you? And when we start to look at cybercrime, it becomes more and more important that we have sock puppets that can be used to lure scammers and cybercriminals into the net. Now, why would we want to do that? You may not be in a law enforcement capacity, you may be in a civil capacity. So why would you want to lure people? Well, you want to lure cybercriminals because you want to stay abreast of what they're doing and how the scams are changing. In order to create that lure, you have to research the victimology. You've got to understand what a cybercriminal looks for in a good victim. And it's going to be different. If their particular game is dating or romance scams, the character they're going to look for in a victim is going to be very different to what they're going to look for in an investment-based scam or cryptocurrency scam. So you have to have different lure profiles, same as you have different sock puppets. You have to have different lure profiles to reel them in. You've got to create a bit of character, some relationships, give it a little bit of authenticity. It doesn't need too much. And then you've got to do the right searches. Now, savvy cyber criminals don't waste their time looking for one victim at a time. They use targeted adverts. They use Google AdWords. They use TikTok. They use Instagram. They use Facebook. They use all of the common platforms in order to draw engagement in and get click-through to whatever their scheme is going to advertise, or to collect mailing addresses for potential victims. Then you've got to reel them in, gather their information, not engage with them. You're using the luring profiles to stay abreast of their technique, to understand their methodology, and what are they going to do next. Depending on your environment and where you're working, if you're working in law enforcement context or commercial environment or private engagement, those policy guidelines will outline for you how far you can push the boundaries and where you can and can't go. Finally, when it comes to your profiles and putting out lures, You've got to resist the urge to automate too much. I love automation. I love Linux and creating scheduled and automated tasks and using some really new tools and some scripts. But at the end of the day, you're an investigator. Investigate. You can't go and buy an investigator off the shelf. You've got to be an investigator. And it's a skill that improves with time and needs refinement over a course of time. So we're going to use an example here of a lure profile that we created in order to trap not to trap somebody, but to engage with somebody who was selling drugs online. Now, we're all used to the fact that in the big bad world of the dark web, drug sales are conventional. It's kind of blatant, if you will. But how blatant does it get when your suspect actually advertises drugs for sale on Facebook? In this case, it was a sanctioned engagement, and we took it off platform and added the scammer in to see just exactly how far he would go. We were working, and again, this also comes nicely back to Sharon's discussion on cognitive bias. We were working to the assumption that the person we were engaging with was simply running an online scam, and he's going to deliver a couple of grams of coke, but you've got to do an e-wallet or a cash send transfer or person-to-person transfer. True enough, he took the conversation off to WhatsApp and actually wanted to arrange a meet. And luckily enough, the meet wasn't too far from where we were. So we obliged, expecting that at the last minute, of course, he's going to say, I'm running late, or you're a new client. No, I'm going to need cash in advance. In this case, he was not particularly happy when he did actually arrive and found a set of cuffs waiting for him instead of a client. But imagine how brazen you have to be to actually go out and actively sell drugs over neighborhood and community groups on Facebook just based on the profile of the person that they're looking at. When we got hold of the suspect's phone in this case, we could see that he was literally trawling through neighborhood groups in his sphere of operations, if you will, and was individually approaching people who appeared to like the illicit things in life. So our lure profile was able to draw him a bit closer. Again, this is a sanctioned environment, so slightly different rules. We go off platform, and we needed to find out if this was just a scam or if he was actually selling drugs. The learning outcome from this, though, is it doesn't matter how obvious and blatant the activity is. It's still possible. The guys are going to do it. They're going to take that chance. They're going to try to emerge to bigger and better things, increasing the client base. And we've seen all sorts of variations of this around South Africa where people have tried illicit activities quite blatantly online. But it showed the effectiveness of lures. Now, you've got to monitor your lures day to day. They can take a little bit of love and attention, more so than your average sock puppet. Finally, you've got to act within your policy guidelines. So I'm not going to harp on that, but you do need to be aware of that. Not all policy guidelines are going to allow that kind of interaction. So let's talk about how do we use this to attack cybercrime at its root. Now, cybercrime has got two pillars on which all cybercriminals vest: technology and scalability. They need access to domains. They need access to victims. They need access to social media platforms. So they have a high technology requirement. And then they've got scalability. The whole attraction of cybercrimes is that you can scale them. If you're going to go after one victim, well, you may as well go after 10. You may as well go after 20, and you might as well go cross-border and try your luck there too. It's the same amount of input for a greater amount of output. But if we can attack both of those pillars, technology and scalability, maybe we can make a difference. So if we look at a lure, the life cycle of a lure is the creation of the lure, solicitation, which might be via an advert or an engagement. Then we move on to the verification. In the example that I'm going to show you now, We look at the age of the domain. We look at the contact details. We establish whether it's a registered business or not. We look for elements of plagiarism with the website. This is not higher grade stuff. It's really quite simple. Once we've confirmed that it is a scam and not a legitimate business, we obviously do a Digital Millennium Copyright Act takedown to the service provider. We report mail abuse to the service provider, and we report the cellular numbers involved to the cellular service providers. We then list those numbers on different forums, including Truecaller, Artists Against 419, and different forums to ensure that we can try and stop victims from falling into the net. So let's see what that looks like. In a typical advanced fee fraud, an email arrives from a government department or a well-known brand inviting people to participate in a tender for a very specific item. And that item is always coded by a particular number or a unique name. The moment a willing victim engages and goes online to look for that particular item, well, they're going to find that there is only one website available that sells that item. They're then going to engage with that website, set up terms, negotiate a price, submit a tender, and then of course the supplier is going to say, we don't know you, you're new, you're going to have to pay a deposit. Once the deposit is paid, obviously the money is gone, and there are roll-ons that feed into pig butchering as well, but let's not go there now. That's the simplicity of an advanced fee fraud. But we can stop them before they get started. We can go over the top and take the fight to them and stop them before they get started. The key to it is always going to be being a recipient of these mails. So in our case, what we do is we create luring profiles. We put email addresses out into the wild. We find pretty much any directory listing where we can put our lure mail addresses on, so that ultimately those mail addresses are going to be circulated. The moment we receive any scammy looking emails, we do reply to them. We don't interact beyond that. We just do one reply so that those lists are circulated scammer to scammer, pig butchering style. It moves around. They love sharing. And as they share, we now fall into that net where we receive these solicitations for tenders and advanced fee fraud first. We're then able to do a Google Trends to look at how many people are looking for that particular item, that unique code that they're after. We can look at the basic domain name and domain attributes. We can see if they're hosting their mail off to Gmail or how are they running. And we can get the abuse details, send off a domain takedown on their domain. In an average week, and again, this is South Africa, it might be more prevalent now than in your countries, but advanced fee fraud is quite a big thing here. We're probably taking between 15 and 20 of these sites down per day. That's every day. It doesn't take a lot of time. Probably takes one of the guys in the war room an hour or two a day in order to process takedowns. The satisfaction is we know that these scams are not going to get to maturity. They're going to be taken out of circulation before they attract their victims. It is one of the weaknesses in running advanced fee scams. If somebody gets onto you before you really latch on and engage correctly with the victim, well, your site's going to get taken down and you're back to the starting point. Again, the two pillars on which cybercrime best: technology on the one side, scalability on the other. We keep pushing back to scalability, taking away the domains. We reduce the ability of syndicates to grow. So what do we learn from that simple exercise? Technology and scalability. Don't let blatant schemes and scams pass you by. Do something. Use your skills. If you can see it's a scam, cut it off. Cut them off at the legs. Take them out before they can actually do the damage to the consumer. We have the skills as OsInt practitioners. It takes a nominal amount of our time every day just to take a few scammers out of circulation. Keep doing it. You've got to know your method and your tool set and how to research those domains. And again, I'm not going to go into tools today. Then we're going to look at one of the bigger projects that we handled this year, which was a global track and trace assignment. Now, this particular scope of work was to identify some 40,000 users that were involved in a financial scheme, and from the available data to confirm the identity and the addresses for service of the different parties involved. So it's quite a complicated task when you consider the numbers. 40,000 is not necessarily a light number, and it's not something you want to do everything by manual investigation, especially when you want to go to the level of an address for service. Okay, so step one in this project, identify the duplication within the source data, use of duplicate usernames, the use of the +1 switch in Gmail addresses, the use of custom domains, sequential usernames, John 1, 2, 3, and matching 256 SHA password values. They were obviously encrypted in the database, so we didn't really care what they were. We just looked at the repetitive use of the password and then matching IP addresses with logins that were staggered from each other. So stage one to a project of this scale was to normalize the data and bring it into a SQL format that we could actually work with and scale down the numbers and the variables that we had to identify. The work was then broken into three tranches. Firstly, the low-hanging fruit. Secondly, those with multiple points of reference. Repetitive use of a name, mail, phone number, Bitcoin wallet, an IP address, password. Those with a higher hit rate were quantified according to a scoring matrix that we set up and were then filtered into tranche 2. Tranche 3, of course, became the snag list, and then tranche 4 was the verifications. To take a sampling of the data, go back and manually verify to ensure that the scripts that we were running were still correct. The toolset collection. Now, the selection of the toolset is part of the planning phase. We had to decide what tools we were going to use. If we left it to each of the investigators in our team, it would probably have taken a lot longer than it did. So we did a lot of scraping of Facebook groups. We looked at a lot of YouTube promos around the scheme itself and collected commentary and user accounts associated to that. We looked at Telegram groups and extracting data from Telegram groups. We used tools like Vortimo just to create API automation to do quick wins, the low-hanging fruit. We did use tools like Scope Now for the snag list and People for tranche 2. We used Truecaller, and admittedly, Scope Now, People, terrific tools that are paid for. So the cheapskate in me prefers non-paid for tools, but sometimes you got to pay for the data if you need it. We used LinkedIn quite excessively in order to marry up LinkedIn connections between different networks within the financial scheme. Ultimately, we used Boolean searches in order to identify name, username, name, and phone number combinations, and to build that into a custom search engine. Top on that, we use selected breach data sets from Facebook breaches and other sources in order to augment and collect more data and increase the hit rate. Eventually, it came down to quite a bit of MySQL work in order to compare the existing data set with the collected data set and narrow out the variables that were available between them to cross-match and compare, and a little bit of Python scripting as well in order to dig a little bit deeper into Telegram, to go a little bit further and automate some of the scraping on Facebook. The Boolean searches that we used within the CSE were really pretty straightforward. We did combinations of email and number, email and phone, name, surname, mail, the username and the scheme name, the person's name and the scheme name, to see if there were promoters of the scheme and we could track them that way. We used the YouTube channel searches, we used Insight as a dork, and we ran multiple engines. We didn't restrict it, obviously, to Google. We used Bing, we used Yandex, we used regionalized searches, and obviously scaled the VPN settings accordingly so that we could localize those searches. For those out of South Africa, you may not realize that when you're inside South Africa and you're searching outwards, a lot of the databases that are American are locked to IP addresses outside of the US. So obviously you have to use a VPN to work around that. We did an extreme amount of Bitcoin validation using a product called Clue. It's a paid-for product, but it was a core part of this product because we were able to identify wallet numbers that went with different users, and that was quite successful in tracing. Finally, we did a lot of manual investigation, not just of the actual accounts that were in the snag list, but also of individual accounts at random. So we'd take a random sampling of 7% of each tranche, and then we would manually assign that to an investigator to ensure that the automated results we were achieving were still matched by manual investigation, and then plotting it out in order to show the build of the scheme and how it evolved over time. Overall success rate of 40,000 users, the majority of which were reasonably anonymous, only had partial data. 80% regional success, so 80% of the users within Southern Africa were identifiable, and 60% international success. So I would have liked to have had 100, but let's be realistic as well. There are limitations in terms of budget, scope, and scale. And on a 40,000 user identification project, that's not a bad success rate. But the key to it, the absolute key, was breaking a very large task into smaller tranches, going for the small wins, taking tranche one of the easy wins and pacing it week by week to the team so that we could keep up their motivation as well. We spent as much time planning this task as we actually did executing it. There was a lot of investigation, planning that went into the methodology we would use, what tool sets were going to be most effective, haggling between the team to decide on how we were going to use those tools, to plan the regionalization and to build keyword lists that we were going to work with. I truly believe if we had not spent the time planning the exercise, it would have probably taken us double the time muddling through it. There were obviously adaptations every week to the way that we were working based on the results. So it was a case of having weekly team meetings in order to reassess the outcomes we were achieving, grade it, and then move on from there. So in summary, you plan. You plan. I don't care if you plan on a scrap of paper or on the latest version of Analyst Notebook or in Word. Doesn't really matter. It's your plan. You don't ever have to show it to anybody, but you have to plan and structure your approach in order to see that you are covering all of the necessary vectors, using the most appropriate and sensible tools. Sock buckets could be used to identify cyber criminals before they rack up their victims. You have to remember the two pillars on which cybercrime vests, and you can attack those and reduce the effectiveness of cyber criminals. In the complex taskings, you've got to break that work into small tranches, and you've got to allow yourself easy wins all along the way to keep yourself motivated. Otherwise, as the project goes on, you're going to get a bit deflated and you're going to get fatigue. Whatever the problem may be, no matter how impossible it seems to find that user, break the problem down into smaller pieces. You don't have to find an address for servers today. Find which country they're in. Then find which area of the country they're in. Then get a little bit closer. Narrow your search down. Applied mathematics, not that complicated. Above all, the one thing I have learned this year, sometimes we're the solution, sometimes we're just a gear in a bigger mechanism. OsInt isn't always about solving the whole problem, solving the whole case. It's about solving one element of, or contributing an element that reignites an investigation and adds something back to it to open new leads and corridors. The view from the trenches is never going to be fun. It's not always pretty. I promised you a non-technical talk this evening. It's literally a couple of things to take away from a year of working on the front line in small projects, in big projects. If I had to summarize what have I learned from the cases that we've taken in this year and interacting with victims on a day-to-day basis and actively doing research and managing a research team. If I had to take a lesson away from the last year, do better. Just do better. Get up, get your ass out of the trenches and go over the top. Take an hour of your day, half an hour of your day, to understand, profile, and look at online cyber criminals who are decimating the digital world in which you and I want to live, and put something back in. If you cut off one scammer by listing them on a database, listing them on Truecaller, reporting a domain, uh, extending an investigation to somebody who can't afford it, it doesn't matter what you do. You're in a world where you are blessed with an investigative ability, you have access to technology, and you have technical skills. It actually behoves you to give a little bit back. Think a bit broader. Think about the internet that we want our kids to have. As you can see from the gay hairs, I'm no longer a youngster. And I want my kids to interact on a safer platform, on an internet that encourages e-commerce, an internet that encourages trust, but with the necessary verifications. If we just get out there every day for half an hour, every day, couple of days, it sharpens our skills, it participates, and it chips away at organized cybercrime on a daily basis and helps us stay a little bit ahead of the fight. So that's about me on time with a couple of minutes left for questions. Thank you for indulging me and putting up with a non-technical talk in a techie day. But I have to admit, I'm excited. I've been taking notes for the last 2 days. It's pretty cool. I've got a lot of homework to do. Some pretty cool ideas to look at, especially on TikTok as well. Grateful for the opportunity, grateful for the interaction. And Stephen, thanks so much for having me back this year.